Chicago Bears general manager Ryan Poles admitted essentially that the team isn't going to find any more high-impact players in free agency. So that means their potential plan at right tackle will have to come in the NFL draft.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis, and of course, our Locked On Bears YouTube video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on the show today, we take a look at where the Chicago Bears might be able to find their starting right tackle in the NFL draft. We'll start with kind of separating some of the options that could be available with the number 9 overall pick. We'll look at some of the options on day 2 of the draft, or potentially a trade down if the Bears ultimately opt to do so. And we'll look at some day 3/late round draft picks that are certainly no guarantee to be a week 1 starter, but the Bears have had luck in that area of the draft as of late, and there's a couple guys we can identify as potential starting caliber offensive linemen that maybe, just maybe, could surprise you as a week 1 starter in a similar vein as Braxton Jones. But Ryan Poles talked about the team's strategy here for upgrading the roster, and we've heard him talk throughout the offseason, admitting we can't fix every single hole all at once, and now he's, I think, peeling back the curtain a little more about the free agency versus NFL draft philosophy. And the quote he had from the NFL owners meeting was that, quote, "When you get to this point of free agency, it drops off. The salaries drop off, talent, experience drops off. You do have a wave of players offensively and defensively that will go through the draft because they kind of want to see how everything settles, so we'll keep an eye on those players. But right now, to improve our team, I think we got to look to the draft." To me, that signals, hey, we're not going to find any other week 1 starters in free agency, at least not right now. Maybe after the draft, some of the veteran, older players that linger up to that point, the same way they signed Riley Reif and Michael Schofield in that range last year. Maybe that's still in the works for the long-term future, or I guess for not the immediate plan for the Bears. But in the meantime, it's the NFL draft. If you want to try and find impact players, potential week 1 starters, or players that can be a part of a rotation as early as week 1. So that points to me clearly to the right tackle position that doesn't have a truly natural penciled in starter just yet. Maybe they could move Tevin Jenkins to that spot as it stands right now. Maybe Larry Borum or Alex Leatherwood in a competition, but it's a pretty big hole there. I think this also applies to the defensive line right now as positions of need that they seem to see the NFL draft as their best opportunity to address. There's a reason why you look at Chicago Bears mock drafts right now. A lot of times you're going to see an offensive tackle. I think the most common player we're seeing at the moment is Paris Johnson Jr. from Ohio State. We talked about him a little bit more in depth last week on a podcast after the Ohio State Pro Day, where we broke down some of Justin Fields' Ohio State teammates. So if you want a little more in-depth on him, you can go back and listen to that podcast. But just to sort of summarize his ability briefly, 36-inch arms, some of the longest arms of offensive linemen or anybody in this NFL draft, moves really, really well. He's got the height, he's got the strength, he's got the speed, he's got the size, he's got all the sort of physical abilities that you would like. Played at a high level in large part because of those tools, and you feel like, man, despite how well he played at Ohio State, you could still even clean up the feet a little bit more and maybe the punch on the hand a little bit more and get like a true Pro Bowl caliber player without too much tweaking on a guy that's already clearly a starting caliber NFL player coming out of Ohio State. And there's a lot of reason to like him as a clear and obvious, draft him at 9 and you either plug him at right tackle or you move Braxton Jones over to right tackle, but either guy could, I think, handle either spot. You see a lot of mock drafts also around Peter Skronsky from Northwestern. He's a guy who has short arms, and so there's a lot of projection for him potentially to guard in the NFL. Some teams will be willing to try him out at tackle. I don't think he would have the shortest offensive tackle arms in the NFL, but I don't know that any starting left tackle last year had arms shorter than him in the NFL. It's not something that we see a ton of at that length, which is why guard tends to be easier because interior defensive linemen don't tend to have as long of arms compared to edge rushers. And often whoever can get their hands on the other one first in terms of the offensive defensive line battles tends to be the one that can win. The arm length makes a big difference in those matchups. So shorter arms tend to play more so on the interior. Not a guarantee for Skronsky. I'm not sure that, based on the type of offensive tackles they prioritized last year between Braxton Jones and Ja'Tyre Carter, I can never pronounce his name right. Those guys are both longer armed offensive linemen, and that seemed to be where the Bears had a preference there. So I get the impression Skronsky is not their guy, but certainly he played like a high-level offensive tackle at Northwestern and could be a potential starter there in the NFL. And then there's Broderick Jones. Number 9 might be a little bit early for some people. Some people like Broderick Jones as the best offensive tackle in the class. There's a more of a wider variety of opinion on him than the other two guys we already mentioned. Broderick is a mauler. He's an angry offensive lineman who kicks butt on the field. He's thick lower body, strong hands, moves really, really well. Like he's a great athlete and seems to fit the type of mold that the Chicago Bears look for. But technique-wise, certainly somebody who bends at the waist quite a bit, which is not good technique, tends to get you off balance and sort of over your feet in that way. That's vulnerability. His hand placement is not phenomenal either. He's just not as experienced of an offensive lineman. Neither is Paris Johnson, if we're being honest here. Both of those guys, you feel like you give them more time at one position and you can really refine something great out of them. And it starts to become, okay, what flavor of offensive lineman are you looking for and who fits your scheme best? I think all of those guys are in the conversation for the 9th overall pick, and they're kind of the main 3 at that spot. There's a handful of other offensive linemen that may be first-round picks, but probably not at the 9th overall pick. Some guys that, if the Bears traded down again from 9, that some other tackles could be in the mix. Or you look, they have 2 picks between 32 and 64, 3 picks between 32 and 64, 2 second-round picks and a third-round pick that's the 64th overall pick. Really, it's like the last pick of the second round. So we'll explore some of the day 2 options for the Bears that could be week 1 starters at right tackle next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers will get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back to you in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. So whatever you bet on, if you don't get it right, FanDuel will make sure it ends up right for you so you can keep playing and keep having fun with FanDuel. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Whether you want to wager on money line or point spreads, whether it's the Final Four of college basketball, men or women, whether it's betting on prop bets for the upcoming NFL draft. You can bet on which wide receiver will be drafted first, which tight end, which defensive player, and which player will take certain prospects, all that and more with FanDuel. So don't miss your chance at a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL and NBA. If the Chicago Bears opt not to go offensive tackle in the first round, maybe it's a pass rusher, maybe it's a cornerback, maybe it's a wide receiver, who knows? If they decide to wait, they should still have a shot at a starting caliber offensive tackle in the second round. Maybe they're not as sure of a thing. Maybe the ceilings aren't as high. There's plenty of reasons to start to poke holes or red flags or just more concerns in these prospects. There's a reason they're day 2 picks, but I think there's a number of guys that offer upside as starting caliber offensive linemen. I think, first of all, there's a group of guys that I don't think will last until the Bears' second round pick, their first of their 2 second-round picks, which is 53rd overall that they got from the Baltimore Ravens. I think Darnell Wright from Tennessee, DeJuan Jones from Ohio State and Anton Harrison from Oklahoma. Probably will all three be off the board by the time you get to 53 overall. But I don't know that any of the three of them are worthy of the 9th overall pick. So they're kind of in this dead zone in between. Darnell Wright, one of these kind of road grader run blockers at the right tackle position, maybe a little slow with his feet, not as much of I don't know if he's as much of a scheme fit in terms of like moving laterally, but he's strong, he's experienced, he's got a lot under his belt, and you kind of know what you're getting with Darnell Wright, even if maybe the ceiling there, the total upside, given some of his athletic limitations, maybe some of that might be what drags him down a little bit farther in this class, but not far enough to make it to the Bears' first, second-round pick. A guy like DeJuan Jones, we've talked about him a few times on the podcast. 6'8.5", 375 pounds, humongous, strong offensive lineman who, of course, is not going to be as agile as the smaller lineman, but moves really well for his size. Someone I'm not super worried about being able to pan out in the NFL, but there's going to be some noticeable weaknesses, some defined weaknesses that come with being that big and that tall and that long and that heavy, but also that strong, that you know what you're getting into and you can minimize those things and still get a very good player out of it. And maybe there's some even more upside there to get a real monster out of that, but some question marks too there about maybe not the perfect fit for every scheme in that regard. And then Anton Harrison from Oklahoma, really fluid athlete at the offensive line position. Looks like a tight end a lot of times at tackle. Really smooth feet, smart, really knows what he's doing, but not like a super strong guy. You don't see strength a lot in the hands and arms in terms of his punch. You don't see a ton of strength in the lower body either. It's not that he's like overly thin. It just he needs to add more strength and a little bit more bulk as he goes to the NFL. But he's already a very established, consistent pass protector, and that's certainly the most valuable aspect of the game for the offensive tackles and where he's going to make his money and have his value. Those three guys to me are more like above where the Bears are picking in the second round, but below where they're picking in the first round. So you would either need to trade down from 9 or trade up from 53 in order to get one of those three guys. A couple of guys that are more in that range at 53 or 61 is their second round pick, and 64 is their first third round pick. That essentially is like the last pick of the second round. I point to Matthew Bergeron from Syracuse, another one of these athletes at the offensive tackle position that just has really great balance. Like he's smart, it's controlled. He's never, going too fast and getting over his skis a little bit. Like he's always seems to be like knows where he's supposed to be and in the right position at all times. He's played both left and right tackle. I believe he's got some versatility to play inside at guard. I think they played him at guard a little bit at the Senior Bowl, so he's shown some of that ability. But it's not that he's like too small to play tackle. It's just like, let's see what he can do. He's not the mean physical butt kicker at offensive tackle. You'd like to pull a little bit more out of that. And from a technique standpoint, he got flagged a lot at Syracuse. It was somebody who would be a little bit too quick to just like wrap up and get flagged for holding. That's, there's some room to clean up some of that stuff, but you feel like he's got he's got his wits about him and knows generally what he's doing, and you can tweak a few things and still feel like you have yourself a pretty solid offensive lineman. Or Jalen Duncan from Maryland, another Senior Bowl prospect. Both of those guys we saw down in Mobile, and we know Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus have raved about the Senior Bowl prospects they've drafted in the past. They seem to really prioritize guys participating in that game to see how they compete. But Duncan, a really quick feet athlete at the tackle position, gets out of his stance well and quickly and moves very fluidly, long arms, long body, etc. When I saw him in Mobile, though, he looked, I don't want to say top heavy, but his legs looked skinnier than I thought they would. It looked like the upper body was bigger and wider than the lower body to match, and it didn't quite fit there. And again, hand technique's not great. He lunges a little bit, certainly in the running game. I think he could use a bit more strength, and I point to that lower body as being part of that. But, Ryan Poles likes lighter, more fluid athletes on the offensive line, and so I think somebody like Jalen Duncan could be a good fit that way, or somebody that fits the style that the Chicago Bears seem to prefer on the offensive line, and likely will be there around the 53rd, 61st, and 64th picks. He and Bergeron, that feels like kind of the range that we're seeing a lot of people project those two offensive linemen, whereas, the likes of Darnell Wright, DeJuan Jones, and Anton Harrison, maybe a little bit earlier and before that. So I think there's some opportunities here, whether it's in the first round or with any of those 3 second-round picks, to get a week 1 starting offensive tackle, or at the very least, someone you feel like that comes in and competes and likely wins that job even if you're not going to hand it to them right away. We have seen Ryan Poles have a small track record of one NFL draft before this, where he waited until the 5th round to take an offensive lineman. He ended up taking, 4 of them on day 3 of the draft and found a week 1 starter in Braxton Jones that exceeded expectations and some other depth pieces there. I don't think it's realistic to go into the draft expecting that you're going to find a week 1 starting tackle every year on the 3rd day of the draft. But we'll look at some of the names we should keep an eye on as potential sleepers or guys that might just fit that mold for the Bears this year. Next on Locked On Bears. I think we're all hoping Ryan Poles goes a little bit quicker on the offensive line draft pick this year compared to last year when he waited so long, especially when the Bears have 2 second-round picks, a third-round pick, and 2 fourth-round picks before 2 fifth-round picks, and then, the 7th after that. Ideally, you grab one with one of those first 4 picks in the top 64. But if for some reason the board doesn't fall that way, or there's just better players at those picks that you feel like, man, okay, you got to grab, hypothetically, the cornerback in round 1, or the pass rusher in round 1, and there's a tight end there in round 2 that you really love, and maybe there's a center, because we're talking about right tackle specifically today. Maybe there's a center like Joe Tippmann from Wisconsin in round 2 that you just feel like you're not quite there to grab the right tackle just there, and it ends up slipping through the cracks a little bit, and you got to wait, and maybe in the 4th round, maybe in the 5th round, probably hopefully not in the 7th round, some other guys that you might like. And the caveat I want to throw on before we go some of these day 3 draft pick names is that once we get to the 4th round, trying to project exactly where these guys are going to be drafted is fool's errand, right? I mean, it's so hard on day 3 of the draft to say, okay, is this guy a 4th round pick? Is this guy a 5th round pick? Is this guy a 6th round pick? Like, usually you can tell who's an undrafted free agent and not, but I'm not here to say, okay, take, for example, Tyler Steen from Alabama with that 4th round pick. Like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how teams are going to evaluate this draft class. I certainly don't have time to watch all 250 plus players that are going to be drafted this year. And I don't have a sense of exactly where these guys are going to go. I do know that, for example, Tyler Steen from Alabama, who I mentioned there, the consensus big boards, when you look at across all the different draft analysts that put out their big boards, he's the number 103rd prospect on average. The Bears happen to hold the number 103rd pick in the NFL draft. That's their first of their 2 fourth-round picks. Steen is interesting. He does have shorter arms like Skoronski. I think they're a good 1/2 to 3/4 inch longer than Skoronski, which doesn't sound like much, but sometimes teams have specific thresholds where you just have to get past a certain point. And perhaps for some teams, Steen's arms will be long enough, but Skoronski's won't. Or maybe you feel like I can take a risk on a shorter armed tackle in the 4th round more than I can with the 9th overall pick in the draft, right? Maybe, okay, I can afford to try it out here and know that I'm not missing out on as much if this pick doesn't work out compared to what I would miss out on if my 1st round pick didn't miss out. But Steen is a guy that, again, I think fits some of what Ryan Poles likes. He's really moves well laterally. He's got great feet. Seems to have a good football IQ. Knows how to combine the hands and feet for timing purposes, right? When to get his hands on pass rushers, timing up with his passing set, right? When he's getting back into stance and when to get that punch in there. It seems like it's kind of clicked for him after transferring to Alabama from Vanderbilt. But at the same time, certainly there's some inconsistency with that technique. You see moments where it's all there for him, and then you see moments where it's kind of gone. And you wonder, he has had some experience here, so is he set in those ways? Are you going to be able to develop that a little bit more, or you're just always going to have an inconsistent guy there? That's why you get to this 4th round conversation, because the high end play is there. That's a starter when you see him at his high end best. And then the low end play is a little bit worrisome here and there. But like you said, if you feel like you can get that out of him, there's a starting caliber player at least right there with a guy like Tyler Steen or a guy like Blake Freeland from Penn State. Not going to be every team's cup of tea. Another one of these 6'8" offensive linemen, not quite 375 pounds like Shaquille O'Neal and DeJuan Jones type, but because that's part of the problem with Blake Freeland, right? Is he's not strong enough or as strong as you would want him to be for a 6'8" offensive tackle. It's he's too tall. We think of that size is valuable, but it's only valuable when it's like strength and weight appropriate, when it's sort of, scales properly. And for him, like, he's so high cut. He's top heavy. He doesn't have enough of that in the lower body. And so he's got good length, but it's like there's not always enough of that like core lower body, like anchor strength behind it to really get the most out of the rest of his physical tools. Like, he moves his feet pretty well and he's got pretty good hands, but it's just like, can you put him in an NFL weight room and an NFL, meal program, so he doesn't have to worry. He's not doing class and he's not doing, he's not worried about how his bills are going to be paid or where his meals are going to come from or anything like that. Like, it's just, you got your contract, you're good to go, eat a bunch and get stronger and work out all the time and just focus 100% on football. Like, can you grow him more? Well, then all of a sudden we're talking about a 6'8" kid with some great tools and already some nice like fluidity movement skills for that size. And maybe you can get something pretty solid out of there. How quickly that happens and how confident teams are in their development ability is why he's again in this like day 3 draft range. I think his consensus big board position is 89. So that becomes, a little bit higher, like, late 3rd round is where his consensus position is. I could see him falling into the 4th round potentially. Again, I don't like to get too caught up in where exactly these guys are going to go, but he feels like a guy who you can put out there and can get by while he continues to kind of gain strength and feel like, man, there's some real tools there that get you excited about him. Or how about Carter Warren from Pitt? If we start going, I think he's a little bit farther down in terms of this draft process, in some part because he's coming off of a torn meniscus from early in this past season, didn't play more. I think he played like 4 games-ish, and that was about it for him. And as a result, you kind of forget about how well he played in 2021 and before. But Warren has these long arms. He's got good hands. Like, it's the kind of like physical tools that we've seen the Bears prioritize in terms of the offensive tackles they took the previous year, but like not as great of feet and a little bit slower. And sometimes he gets too high because he knows he can just kind of get up there and get his arms out and isn't as focused as like getting the arms under. He just, he has the length and the good hand placement that he's gotten away with not having to be like great leverage in terms of power generation. But as a result, he doesn't consistently generate enough power. And you feel like, if you can work out that pad level a little bit more and really fine tune how he's applying his own physical force as an offensive lineman, he should be fine as a result. But again, between the injury and maybe some technique that you got to clean up and not being the fastest, most fluid offensive lineman, he falls a little bit and ends up being a little bit farther down in this process. And there's quite a wide range of where you'll see people have Carter Warren ranked. He seems to be a fairly polarizing offensive tackle prospect, and I think the upside is definitely there as a potential starting caliber offensive tackle. One small school guy I want to throw in here real quick because we know the Bears haven't been shy to take small school players, especially on the offensive line, is Nick Saldiveri. I think I'm pronouncing that right, from Old Dominion. Saldiveri. This is a big, fluid athlete. Like, he moves well, but has the size too. I think he's like 6'6", 310, 15 pounds. He's big and he moves. And when you have guys that are big and can move, you feel like, okay, you can start to teach some of the other things he might need. He's fluid. He's smart. He gets the game, but like not the strongest in the world. But again, Old Dominion, I think, no offense to Old Dominion, but going from that to an NFL, nutrition program and weight program, you feel like you can add some of the strength there. In terms of like, he doesn't always shoot with his hands exactly where they need to go. They can go a little bit wide there, and that the placement is not consistent enough. And again, no disrespect to the Old Dominion coaching staff. I'm sure there's a lot of talented people there, but you wonder if, again, you get him with an NFL offensive line coach, if you can click on those things a little bit better and take a small school guy that might be overlooked that has some physical tools that fit what the Bears like in terms of size, length, fluidity, and intelligence, football IQ, a desire to play the game, and maybe you can get something special there late in this draft. I mean, he's not going to be, I don't think, the 4th round type guy. He's going to be the 6/7th round guy. I mean, again, I don't want to get too married into this. His consensus big board spot is pick 202, which would be the 6th round there. The Bears don't have a 6th round pick, so where in that range, whatever. But that's kind of the small school guy I would keep an eye on that I feel like has some of those Bears types of offensive tackle traits that you might look for that they could draft late. Maybe they come in with low expectations, and by the end of training camp, that's your starting right tackle who wins the competitions and plays really well. So the Bears have options here. I don't like the idea of Ryan Poles going into the NFL draft and essentially admitting like, hey, we kind of have to fill some needs in the draft. And I don't like the idea of drafting for need. I like drafting the best player available regardless of position. And the idea was that free agency was supposed to fill the needs. So you could draft whatever players you want, but you can't fill every need in free agency. And I do believe that's true also, that there's a such thing as spending too much, even when you have all this cap space. And it's like, darned if you don't. I can say damn on this podcast. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. I was trying to be careful there, but like it's not on the caliber of swear words anymore. We've moved. I feel like in modern era, we've moved to a different level of like which swear words we view as appropriate and not. So I'm going to say damn on the podcast, but I'll keep the harsher curse words off. I certainly don't swear much in this podcast. So damned if you do sign a bunch of free agents. Damned if you don't sign a bunch of free agents. Damned if you do draft for need and get players that, well, I think Bears fans would love to see them draft some needs and fill some needs, but also don't want them to reach on needs. And damned if you don't fill those needs, because you got to fill those needs, but you want best player available. So it's not an easy position for Ryan Poles. Whatever he decides to do at right tackle and with all the draft picks, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, check out all of our other Locked On Chicago sports podcasts here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We have your team every day. That includes Locked On Bulls, Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, baseball season. What opening day is next week, I believe. College sports, Locked On Illini and Locked On Northwestern. Or even if you like other sports teams that aren't in the Chicago or greater Illinois area, we've got a Locked On podcast for you. So go check out some of our other Locked On shows. Come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears. I think we'll get to Bijan Robinson tomorrow. Again, pending anything bigger and more important popping up, and why the Bears should not draft a running back with the 9th overall pick, and probably shouldn't in the second round either. Like wait till day 3 of the draft. I don't even third round. Like let's push that back even farther. We'll talk about that tomorrow or Friday. Maybe we'll push it back to next week. Coming up soon on the Locked On Bears podcast. Come on back for that, and come on back for your next opportunity to bear down.